Hey everyone, welcome to week 54. This is day 4. This is Thursday. This is our ongoing water mixable oil paint. And so far, so good. Results have been a little varied. I think I have to get used to the handling, especially of the water mixable paints. But I'm liking what I see. So we'll see how we do today.
Okay, let's get started. This is day 4. This is Thursday. This is our ongoing water mixable oil paint. So it's been 3 days. This is going to be our 4th day where I've been working with these water mixable paints. Remember, this is the first time I have ever tried these paints. I had seen before other people tried them. My impression of them trying to paint with these paints, of the way these paints handled while I was watching those people paint, was very different from the one that I'm having right now. I'm pretty sure that the election of my starting materials has something to do with that. So just to remind people, I'm still working on a very inexpensive watercolor paper. It's a watercolor paper that when I look at the reviews, people dislike it a lot. People think it's a horrible watercolor paper. I don't use it for watercolor. I don't have a ton of experience with watercolor painting. So I have to say that I wouldn't be able to recognize what a good watercolor paper looks like as opposed to a very crappy watercolor paper. For me, watercolor is just insanely difficult. And if you give me a very expensive paper or a very cheap one, the results are probably going to be the same. But what's funny is that I got this paper from Katie. I talked about this before. She's a brilliant painter. And I had no expectations and I started using the paper just because. That's the way I usually paint. I kind of look at the materials that I have lying around. If I need a substrate, if I need a surface, if I have paper lying around, I'm going to grab paper. If I have pre-primed linen lying around, I'll paint on that. I do it because I want to teach myself how to be able to adjust constantly. Now, if you look back on the first year of this project, I was using a variety of surfaces. Mainly I was using either pre-primed paper where I would seal the paper with a transparent acrylic binder, and I could either paint on top of it with just that acrylic binder, or I could give it a base of gray acrylic paint, or I could just put a wash of umber on top of it just to give me like a nice toned ground. I was using that, so primed paper, or I was using linen that I had lying around. I had a very nice, I think it's a poly linen mix. I'm not entirely sure that it was pure linen, but it was really nice material and it was universally primed. So I would also either work on that pre-primed linen, or I could also tone that linen with, again, a gray acrylic base or with just like a raw umber earthy tone. And those were my surfaces. But at some point, and this was all inspired by Olga Woznanska. So today we're going to have like a Polish undertone to this painting. Often when I speak about Olga Woznanska, I describe that first moment when I saw her paintings I think it was in Warsaw when I first saw her paintings. And I was blown away. I mean, it's one of those experiences that I've very rarely felt when looking at paintings from any other artists. And I've been fortunate enough to travel throughout this world, and I've been able to finally see with my own eyes a lot of paintings that I've seeked. It's almost like I'm part of this procession where I'm trying to get to these wonderful paintings. So I haven't seen all of the paintings that I would want to see before I die. There's a bunch of paintings in Russia, for example, that I've never seen. So I am missing a trip to St. Petersburg and to Moscow. But I was fortunate enough to travel to Poland and to have that experience that really, it was life-altering. It changed everything that I knew about painting or that I thought I knew about painting. And one of the things that impressed me the most and that was shocking to me at that time was that Olga Woznanska was painting on raw cardboard. It was a toned piece of cardboard that was either naturally toned that way, it had a yellow-brownish native tone, or it either yellowed with time because probably the acidity in those cardboards was just incredibly high, and those are surfaces that are going to obviously suffer with the pass of time. But that never bothered me. It has never, ever bothered me. In fact, it was just incredible to see how somebody with such a sort of primeval surface would get results that I had never experienced before. And a lot of the paint handling, a lot of the modeling that she was able to achieve with her paintings was due to the fact that she was working on these highly absorbent surfaces. And I always had this thing in my head that I wanted to try to paint that way. But for some reason, I think that the knowledge that I had on materials of painting, on the tradition of painting, had become sort of an obstacle. Like I didn't grant myself the chance, the possibility to do a series of paintings, at least, on raw surfaces that would provide me with an experience that I could then later gauge. You know, I could then evaluate how that experience measured up to painting on traditionally primed surfaces. But for many, many years, I just didn't give myself the chance. I just always thought it was wrong. Like I thought in very binary terms. I thought this is the proper way to paint. And if you paint on a surface that is not primed, it is wrong. You know, you're not supposed to do this. You're going to put the stability of the painting at risk. I always took that as a dogma in painting. And years ago, I don't know what changed in me, but I just realized that none of those things matter. That painting to me is not a set of rules. It's not a contract that we sign and that then we have to uphold throughout our lives. That is not what I love about painting. I love that painting is just a very simple, fundamental thing. You know, you just grab some pigments, you mix them with a binder, and you express something through them. You interpret something through them. It could be nature, it could be a feeling. It doesn't matter. There's no rules to this. And the part that became super important for me is that if I became a passenger sort of in this journey that I would have with painting, and that painting could become this company for my life. It wasn't just about this being my job. It wasn't just about me producing paintings. This was not the product of what I was a professional at. You know, I was a professional artist and specifically a painter, and I was supposed to do paintings. That was a very simple equation. No, painting was far bigger than that for me. It was literally the way in which I would try to make sense of everything that was going on around me. It was the way in which I would give myself a portion of time during the day where I would just think, where I would evaluate, where I would reflect upon everything that was going on in my life. And even though the things that I would think about didn't necessarily have to be materialized in the painting act, that moment where I was painting, became vitally important for me in trying to solve those issues. Painting didn't have to provide me with an answer. It didn't have to be the result. It was not like this equation produced a painting. No, painting is almost like this side dish that just happens to be produced because I am thinking through paint. But it was never about trying to find an answer or to understand the painting, the object of painting, as an answer. And I think that when I started believing in those things, I told myself, I'm going to start painting on paper. You know, and I'm going to start doing things that I've always heard are wrong. And to give it justice, I'm going to try to understand why they have been interpreted throughout the years as being wrong. But I'm also going to take a stand and say, this is what I want to do, regardless of those reasons, knowing that that is the risk that I would be assuming. But honestly, in my mind, it was never a risk. I mean, the risk is that the painting is going to change through time. And I've always found that fascinating. I've always found that beautiful. I mean, most of the paintings that I love and that I enjoy, they have changed through time. And I can totally understand this effort where we want to keep them as constant. Because if we keep them as constant, we are assuring ourselves the possibility that people in the future can have the same experience that people had at the time when the painting was produced, and that we are having right now, and that, 200 years into the future, people may have with those paintings. So this is about fairness in a way, so that we all have the same chance to experience, not the same painting, because the painting is going to change with the passage of time in the sense that it's always going to be viewed differently. But at least this is the way we can assure that the starting point is the same for all of us. And when I say all of us, I'm not speaking all of us right now. I'm speaking all of us throughout thousands of years. I don't think we're going to be here for thousands of years, but that's another conversation. So at some point I was like, okay, I'm willing to knowingly make those sacrifices. And I'm doing them just because I want to have that experience. I want to be able to access those things. I mean, I can't paint like Olga Woznanska. Nobody can. But I want to have some of those experiences that I saw that moved me, honestly, to tears. I was like, my knees were buckling. I felt a hole in my stomach. I knew that I was experiencing something that was going to be one of the most important things that I had ever experienced in my life. It was that big for me when I saw her paintings, and it was completely unexpected, and I think that has something to do with it also. So some years ago, I started painting on raw paper, and I absolutely love it. I think I understand now everything that is happening to paint and how the substrate is being affected by whatever medium we're using or whatever binder it's actually absorbing from the paint, or however the pigment is actually affecting the paper in the end. I understand those things, but I also understand the way paint handles on raw paper, and I adore it. I would love to tell you guys that I could be objective about this and that I could just tell you, okay, these are the things that are going on. These are the pros, these are the cons. We've had this experience and we should go back to painting in more traditional ways. But this was my stop. I got out in this station and I saw what was wonderful about this place, and I wanted to call this my home. You know, this is where I stayed. A bunch of people just keep going on that train, and they're heading to completely different places, and they're going to understand some of these other places as homes. But this was me. I stepped out and I was like, this is my paradise. This is what I absolutely love. And sure, maybe things will change because it's not very practical painting on paper. I depend on paper size, on the brand of paper, on the makeup of the paper. So there's a ton of variables that make the painting experience very different. Now, why am I saying this? Why are we talking about raw surfaces? Why are we talking about my experience with paper? Well, simply because I think that all those things that are inherent to painting on raw paper are turned up to 11 when I started painting with these particular paints. Again, I'm not really sure what is happening because it seems to me that there is a slower, maybe absorbency of the oil when I'm working with traditional oil paints, and I'm working on top of this same really crappy, inexpensive watercolor paper. But when I paint with traditional oil paint, it just feels different. I mean, it feels stiff because it's always going to feel stiff because it's a highly absorbent surface. But there is some give to it. There is room where you can kind of maneuver the paint that you're putting down. With this particular brand, and I'm not generalizing because from what I've heard, different brands feel very, very differently from one another. So for this specific brand, this Winsor Newton brand, this artisan brand of water mixable oil paints, I feel that there's an absorption taking place and that I'm left with paint that is a bit harder to try and push around. I have to be a lot more definitive with my mark making. I think it all translates to that. Like, I have to put something down, and I'm not going to be able to move it around as much as I do when I have traditional oil paint. So I either have to just put it down and let it be, or I have to build my painting based on a succession of singular brushstrokes. I hope that makes sense. It kind of makes sense in my head, but I hope it makes sense for you guys. I think this is all happening, and it's all very native to this particular watercolor paper and this particular brand of water mixable oil paint, and the fact that I'm only using water as my medium. You know, a lot of people have suggested that that's not a good medium, that I should be using, you know, these water miscible mediums that are available, and that water is really a nice solvent, but it's not really a great medium for the paints, and that the experience would be completely different if I was using at least a, you know, sealed surface, a sealed substrate. It could be this paper, but you know, if I could seal it, if I could prime it properly, then I would have a better feeling of how the painting actually behaves. And I totally understand all of those things. I hope you guys also understand where I'm coming from, where I believe that paint should be understood from its very basic form. You know, pigment and binder, and that's it. You know, there's so many things that can be done with paint and binder that there's no real need to overcomplicate things. Now, you could say that with gouache or watercolor or casein painting, you have to add water. Like, if you try to paint with that paint straight out of the tube, it's impossible. And yes, I totally acknowledge that. And I have been using water as my medium for this paint. It's not like I'm not giving myself the chance to extend the paint. I'm doing so with water. But even that feels a little different. Even that doesn't feel quite like gouache, I would say. The end result has a very gouache feel to it, but not really. It's completely different. I think it deceptively looks like gouache because we have that access to those initial very washy layers. but it's not really gouache, not at all. It's very, very different in terms of its nature, and its handling couldn't be any more different. Perhaps the part where they meet is when I described that this paint is asking of me to be far more committed with my decisions. I think with gouache, you also get the same thing. You have to make decisions. You have to be able to dissect every single decision that you made in that gouache painting. I think that those are the most beautiful gouache paintings. Again, this is very subjective, but I think that that's a trait that you could say carries over to the way in which I'm trying to interpret these water mixable oil paints. But because I'm trying to remain true to those starting variables, to working on raw paper and to only using water, when I work with papers like this one, with highly absorbent paper, I realize that it is a tough painting, that it is probably exhibiting everything that is, I don't want to say a weakness of these paints, but it certainly is something that we have to be conscious about. And what I'm noticing again is that, paint feels very, very matte, very gray even. And it's not quite a parallel between how, gouache oxidizes and then changes its value and changes its saturation a little bit. It's not quite that. It just feels different. That's why yesterday I said that the best answer that I could come up with is that because the surface is so absorbent and it's separating the binder from the pigment, that separation is actually causing the paint to behave in a very specific way, to look a very specific way. Just because if you think about it, the first thing that surface is going to want to do is absorb all the oil and the modified oil. So what we usually get when we work on raw surfaces is that the paint that remains on that surface feels almost like clay-like. And that's totally normal because there is separation taking place. But depending on what your binder is, I guess, painting is going to look and feel very, very different. So in this case, I'm getting like a very gray, a very dead feeling from the paint. Now, don't get me wrong. These things, if you think about them in terms of saturation and contrast, they would be terrible, right? But if you see them from my shore, where I love to paint with grays, I just absolutely love to paint with like dead color, I love it. I'm starting to really appreciate what I have there. I have to fight with the paint a little bit, but I'm really, really liking that there's this nature, almost like this hidden nature to this paint that I'm really, really enjoying. So today I wanted to push the fact that there is this underlying grayness to it. So I'm painting Fer, this jester-like figure of Fer that immediately, this was inevitable, but immediately took me to, again, and this is why Poland was going to be this river running underneath, this whole session of painting. But it took me to Jan Matejko, the amazing historical painter, huge figure in Polish painting history. Jan Matejko's depiction of Stanszik. That Matejko painting is very, very famous. Stanszik was a jester, a court jester in the Renaissance. It's a wonderful, powerful painting. I remember that painting. I remember Leon Wisiolkowski also painting Stanszik, and that's a beautiful painting. The symbolism of that painting, Stanszyk's soul suffering for Poland, apparently it's a figure that wasn't just doing social commentary through satire, like jesters would be given the chance to do from time to time, but it seems like Stanszik cared greatly about his country and was incredibly intelligent. So this is him just understanding what the fate of Poland was in the mid-1500s, and him just expressing his almost powerlessness over what was going on. So I love that in Wisiolkowski's painting, there's a ton of gorgeous color to it. It's almost close to, it's probably a little more impressionistic than the Merritt Chase Keying Up painting, which is also a glorious painting. It reminds you of the extent of what a jester would have to go through to try to entertain people. But I'm obviously reminded of these, 3 court jester paintings. I think they're very, very famous. But when I was thinking of Fer, and I didn't dress her up this way, this is just her being dramatic. So this is just Fer being Fer. I usually don't set up my paintings. I'm going to say that 99% of the things that I do are things that I stumble over. Subject matter that I just, keep my eyes open and I just find in nature. But I very rarely want to set things up. I'm not that sort of painter. I much rather discover the things that I want to paint rather than just set them up. It's not that I don't like that. It's just that I don't understand myself as that sort of painter, as that sort of artist. So Fer put her tutu in her head, and she was wearing in February her Christmas pajamas, because that's her. And I just saw her and I was like, oh, this is perfect. And it's like deadpan Fer. Fer is actually growing. She's 9, but she's actually becoming this human being that I think is capable of understanding satire and sarcasm, which is amazing. I absolutely love that about my kids, that they both Samu and Fer have very distinct personalities, and they are kind of understanding who they are. And Fer, again, if I can just describe her as something, is just complete deadpan. And I hope, I'm not going to condition her in any way, but I hope that that remains true as she's growing up, because I think that would make her the coolest person in this universe. But, you know, that's what I saw, and that's what I wanted to paint. And I thought that this paint being very dead, you know, be it by its own inherent qualities or by the conditions that I'm subjecting it to, regardless, the result is a very gray, unsaturated matte paint. And I was like, this is perfect. This blank stare of Fer and this pseudo-dramatic character that she constructed, I was like, this is going to be the perfect meeting of my substrate, my paints, my subject matter, the emotion that's being projected by my subject matter, and the way I'm receiving and interpreting that information with those very same tools. This is just meant to be. These are all the variables in this equation working towards a single very strong painting. And I was like, yep, I'm going to paint this, and it has to make sense. And I think this was an opportunity during this week where I felt that even though those things that I've considered like bumps on the road where I could be very critical of how the paint behaves, I was like, no, these are things that are now enabling me to communicate exactly what I want to say about Fer. So I thought it was one of those very simple paintings that just clicks and it makes sense. I'm not saying it's a perfect painting, but I really feel, and again, this is super subjective, but I really feel just things fell into place. And, you know, when you're painting, you can't ask for anything better than that. So that's going to be it for today. A good day is always a day where I can mention Olga Woznanska and where I can think about Jan Matejko. I don't often talk about other Polish painters. They're incredibly talented. But if I could mention Leon Wisiolkowski, then, you know, that's a great day. And if we can also mention Merritt Chase, then poof, there could be a snowstorm outside and it's all warm and fuzzy up in here. I don't know what that meant. I'm sorry. Anyways, that's going to be it for today. Tomorrow we finish up this week of water mixable oil paint. So we'll see if we can finish strong. I think we can. We're going to change the paper because I used Hanemulo paper to paint Siebe on Monday. Then Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, I used the Artist Loft 9x12 watercolor pad. That's terrible. It's like 2 stars when you look at the reviews. And tomorrow, I think I'm going to use the Moleskine paper. So we're going to see how all those papers kind of feel and behave, and if they behave differently. But that's going to be tomorrow. So I'll see you guys tomorrow. Thank you. Bye.
The essence